The tragedy of Frances Ford Seymour's life when she married the Moral Compass Henry Fonda. The divorce in the dark. Henry Fonda was the most trusted man in America. Not because he said so, not because he campaigned for it, because for 4 decades he stood in front of a camera and demonstrated it with every role he chose. The man of conscience, of principle, of absolute moral clarity. Audiences did not merely admire him, they believed him. When Henry Fonda played a man standing alone against injustice, nobody questioned whether he meant it. The performance and the person felt like the same thing. That is precisely why what he did to his wife in the spring of 1950 needs to be told exactly as it was. Not as a marriage that fell apart, not as a tragedy of circumstance, not as 2 people who were simply wrong for each other and eventually went their separate ways. This is what actually happened. In April of 1950, Henry Fonda had his wife committed to Craig House Psychiatric Hospital in Beacon, New York, and then filed for divorce. He did not tell her directly. He sent a lawyer, an intermediary, an administrative messenger carrying paperwork that informed her that her marriage, her children, her identity, and her future had been decided, while she was locked inside those walls and, by legal definition, too mentally compromised to fight back. He chose that timing deliberately. Frances Ford Seymour was 42 years old. She had been Mrs. Henry Fonda for 12 years. She had given him 2 children, Jane, age 12, and Peter, age 10. She had managed his household, maintained his public image, absorbed his coldness, and swallowed his repeated infidelities without once making a sound in public. She was a Ford, a Seymour. She had her own money before she ever knew his name. None of it gave her any protection on the day those papers arrived. Inside the hospital, there was a razor, standard issue, the kind left on a bathroom without a second thought. The kind that a woman who had spent 6 weeks being systematically dismantled by the man she had built her life around could reach for in the moment she understood, with complete clarity, that no one was coming. On April 14, 1950, Frances Ford Seymour's 42nd birthday, she died that morning at Craig House. Henry Fonda was in New York City rehearsing a new play. The woman he intended to marry, Susan Blanchard, 22 years old, stepdaughter of composer Oscar Hammerstein II, was waiting. The wedding took place in December of that year, 8 months after Frances died. He did not wait long. Frances did not die because of mental illness. She was destroyed by a man who used the medical system as a mechanism, divorce paperwork as an execution order, and the walls of a private institution to ensure that when he made his move, she would have no means of responding. This is not a tragedy. A tragedy is something that happens to people regardless of what anyone does. This happened because one specific man made specific choices in a specific sequence with the composure of someone who had planned it in advance. That man was Henry Fonda, the man America was still trusting the entire time. And that is the part of the story they did not tell you. Who they were before they found each other. To understand what happened in that hospital room in 1950, you have to understand who these 2 people were before they walked into each other's lives in 1936. Henry James Fonda was born on May 16, 1905, in Grand Island, Nebraska. He grew up in Omaha, the son of a printer, a quiet, disciplined household where emotion was not performed and sentiment was not rewarded. Nebraska in those years was not a place that trained men to be emotionally available. It trained them to work, to endure, and to keep what they felt to themselves. When Henry was 14, his father took him to witness something that would mark him for the rest of his life. A black man named Will Brown was lynched and burned by a mob in Omaha. Henry Fonda never forgot it. By most accounts, it was the event that shaped his instinctive revulsion toward injustice and gave him the moral framework that would later define his most celebrated roles. He found acting almost by accident through a community theater in Omaha. By the late 1920s, he had moved to New York. By the mid-1930s, he was a working stage actor with enough momentum to get himself cast in Hollywood productions. He was tall, angular, unhurried in his delivery, qualities that translated directly into the kind of quiet authority that cameras loved. He was also, by the accounts of nearly everyone who knew him well, deeply uncomfortable with emotional intimacy. He could express principle, he could express outrage, he could carry the weight of a moral argument across an entire film without a false note. What he could not do, and what those closest to him documented repeatedly, was be present in a room with someone he was supposed to love. That gap between the man on screen and the man at home is not a footnote in Henry Fonda's story. It is the story. Frances Ford Seymour was born on April 4, 1908, in Brockville, Ontario, the daughter of Eugene Ford Seymour, a lawyer, and Sophie Bauer, whose family carried documented connections to Edward Seymour, older brother of Jane Seymour, the third wife of King Henry VIII. It was not merely a genealogical curiosity. The name Jane Seymour Fonda, given to Frances's most famous daughter, was a deliberate tribute. Frances came from a family that understood lineage, and what lineage was supposed to protect you from. By her 20s, she had become precisely what her background seemed to promise, a transatlantic socialite of the first order, equally at home on Fifth Avenue and in the English country houses where old money and new money met between the wars. Photographs from that period show a woman of startling composure, blonde, fine-boned, the kind of carriage that communicated social confidence before a single word was spoken. She dressed with restraint. She moved through society with the ease of someone who had never needed to prove her right to be in the room. But beneath that exterior, a wound had already been inflicted that would never fully close. Frances's father, Eugene, did not grow old. Following a deeply public and humiliating divorce proceeding initiated by Frances's mother on grounds of cruelty, Eugene Seymour locked himself in a room and took his own. Frances was a young woman when it happened. What followed was not grief counseling, not open conversation, not any of the language we now use for a family navigating trauma. What followed was the immediate, efficient reassembly of the family's public presentation. The show continued. The code demanded it. The lesson Frances absorbed was not spoken aloud. It did not need to be. Pain is to be hidden. Weakness is a private shame. And the men in your life will leave. Through death, through abandonment, through choices you have no power over. And when they do, the only permissible response is to straighten your back and carry on. She would spend the next 20 years trying to build a life that proved that lesson wrong. She never quite managed it. Her first marriage, in 1931, was to George Tuttle Brokaw, a wealthy lawyer, 20 years her senior, a figure of some social standing in New York circles. On paper, it was the alliance her world had trained her to make. Behind closed doors, Brokaw was an alcoholic with a volatile temper, and the marriage was, by most accounts, an unhappy and, at times, abusive one. Frances left after 5 years. She filed for divorce. The fact that she did, that she chose her own dignity over the performance of a workable marriage, says something important about her that tends to get lost in how this story is usually told. She was not passive. She was not someone who simply absorbed whatever was done to her without agency. She was a woman operating inside systems that rewarded her compliance and punished her resistance at every turn. And she kept making the harder choice anyway. She was 28 years old, a divorced mother with a young daughter, when she traveled to London and met Henry Fonda on the set of a film called Wings of the Morning. The origins of the collapse. They married in September of 1936. She was 28. He was 31. Frances relocated everything: her life, her daughter Pan from her first marriage, her social world, her sense of what came next, and moved to California. They bought land in Brentwood and built a sprawling farmhouse-style estate. Frances designed the gardens herself. She cultivated the grounds, managed the household, coordinated the kind of dinner parties that people in post-war Hollywood still remembered decades later for their elegance and their ease. She did all of this with her own money. Henry Fonda came into the marriage with talent and momentum. Frances came with the financial foundation that made the life around that talent possible. The house they lived in, the stability that let him take risks with difficult material, the social position that opened certain doors, these things were built on what she brought. Jane was born in 1937, Peter in 1940. From the outside, it looked exactly as it was meant to look. The perfect household of a rising American actor. Gracious home, accomplished wife, 2 beautiful children, a garden that won local admiration. From the inside, something different was taking shape. Henry Fonda was not cruel in the ways that are easy to name and confront. He did not shout, he did not threaten. What he did was subtler, and for Frances, ultimately more corrosive. He was simply absent, not geographically, but in every way that mattered, emotionally unreachable, professionally consumed. Present at the dinner table in body while being somewhere else entirely in every way that counted. His children have described this with considerable consistency across the decades. Jane Fonda has written and spoken extensively about what it was to grow up in that house. The sense of being permanently evaluated, the feeling that love was conditional on performance, the particular anxiety of wanting something from a father who had systematically removed himself from the position of being able to give it. Peter Fonda described the dinner table as a frightening place, an occasion for judgment rather than warmth. What Jane and Peter experienced as children, Frances experienced as a wife. The man she had married, the man whose quiet intensity had seemed in London in 1936 like depth, turned out to have a very different relationship to intimacy than the one she had projected onto him. His intensity was not the capacity for feeling turned inward. It was the absence of that capacity, given the appearance of gravity. Frances began to show the strain of this in ways her era had no useful language for. She became more withdrawn, more anxious, more erratic in her behavior. She developed what her children later recognized as an eating disorder, a textbook response to a life in which control over her body was the only control she had left. She underwent a series of hospitalizations through the 1940s. Not, as Henry's account of these years would later suggest, because she was simply a troubled woman whose instability preceded him, but because the specific conditions of her marriage, the emotional unavailability, the relentless performance expectations, the requirement to be perfect in public while receiving nothing in private, were accelerating a deterioration that had roots in much earlier damage. And then the war ended, and Henry Fonda came home, and things got worse, in a way that removed any remaining ambiguity about what kind of man he was prepared to be toward her. At some point in 1949, Henry Fonda told Frances that he was involved with another woman. Her name was Susan Blanchard. She was 23 years old, less than half his age, younger than the marriage itself. He wanted a divorce. He intended to remarry. Frances collapsed. What happened next is where the story stops being complicated and starts being a matter of record. Pay attention to the sequence. Frances broke down because of what he told her. Fonda used that breakdown to have her committed to Craig House. He used her commitment, her legal designation as a psychiatric patient under institutional supervision, to file for divorce without having to face her. And he used her documented mental health status to ensure that if she attempted to dispute any part of what was happening, her account would be assessed against the word of a man whose public credibility was essentially unchallenged. Every step created the conditions for the next one. This was not the behavior of a man who found himself in an agonizing situation and made imperfect choices under pressure. This was the behavior of a man who identified the most efficient method of removing an inconvenient person from his life and executed it with considerable precision. Craig House was not a grim institutional facility. Its grounds covered 40 acres of manicured Hudson Valley landscape. Patients arrived by private car. The architecture was Victorian country house. The horror of what it meant to be confined there was dressed in the language of rest and recovery. Wealthy American families had been using places like it for decades, not primarily to treat illness, but to manage the presence of relatives whose behavior had become publicly inconvenient. Zelda Fitzgerald had been held in a facility of this kind. So had Rosemary Kennedy, whose family's management of her institutionalization would later become one of the most documented examples of how the medical establishment of that era collaborated with powerful families to ensure that inconvenient women stayed out of sight. Frances would have understood, with complete clarity, what the arrival of a lawyer carrying divorce papers inside those walls meant. She was not a woman of limited intelligence. She had managed households, navigated social hierarchies, and handled a substantial inherited estate. She understood how systems worked, and she understood that the system had just been arranged around her in a way that left her no exit. She could not leave the facility. She could not credibly contest the proceedings. She could not reach her children. She could not tell her version of events to anyone who had the standing to act on it. The option of resistance had been removed before the paperwork arrived. 8 weeks. In the weeks after the divorce papers were delivered, Frances wrote letters. Not farewell letters. Letters about ordinary things, as if maintaining the thread of normal correspondence with the outside world was the last available method of insisting that she still existed as a person, rather than a case number inside an institution. Before the morning of April 14, 1950, she wrote 6 of them. 1 to Jane, 1 to Peter, 1 to her mother, 1 to her nurse, 1 to her psychiatrist. She did not write 1 to Henry Fonda. That omission, among everything else that can be said about the final weeks of Frances Ford Seymour's life, may be the most articulate thing she ever communicated. She had spent 12 years in a marriage that required constant management of his needs, his image, his comfort, and his public presentation. In the hours before she died, she thought of 6 people. He was not one of them. April 14, 1950, was her 42nd birthday. Henry Fonda was in New York City that morning. He had a rehearsal. The cover-up and the cost. The news reached him the way events reach men who have arranged to be elsewhere, as a phone call, a notification, a piece of information delivered from a distance that he had deliberately maintained. What he did next is the part of this story that transforms it from a private tragedy into something that implicated everyone around him. Henry Fonda decided that the truth of how his wife died was too messy, too inconvenient, too damaging to the image that was the primary asset of his professional life. He arranged for it to be managed. The family released a statement to the press. Frances had died of a heart attack. He then told the same thing to Jane and Peter. Jane was 12 years old. Peter was 10. In December of 1950, 8 months after Frances's death, Henry Fonda married Susan Blanchard in a ceremony attended by figures from New York's theater world and social elite. Oscar Hammerstein II was present. The occasion was framed as a new beginning. Jane Fonda, 13 years old, stood at her father's wedding to a woman 9 years older than herself, in possession of the information that her mother had died of cardiac failure. She did not know the truth. She learned it approximately a year later when a classmate passed her a celebrity magazine during study hall. The glossy pages, designed to titillate, not to console, informed her that her mother had not died of a heart attack, that her mother had taken her own inside a psychiatric facility, that the story her father had told her was constructed for his own convenience, not for hers. Jane Fonda was 13 years old when she found out, in a school classroom from a gossip publication, that her father had lied to her about the most important fact of her childhood. The consequences of that discovery, and of the conditions that preceded it, extended across the entirety of both children's adult lives. Jane Fonda spent approximately 30 years managing an eating disorder. In her memoir, and in subsequent interviews, she has connected it directly to the psychological environment of her childhood. The sense of never being sufficient, the terror of abandonment, the weight of being raised by a man who communicated consistently and without apparent awareness that love was a reward for performance rather than a given. She has described assuming, well into her adult life, that she would not survive past 30. She was among the first prominent women to speak about eating disorders publicly, at a time when doing so was professionally costly and socially stigmatized. The courage it took to do that was the same quality that her father performed on screen his entire career, and spent his private life making impossible for the people closest to him to exercise. Peter Fonda attempted suicide as a teenager. He was later diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, which he traced to the conditions of his early childhood. He spent decades, by his own account, managing the psychological damage of growing up in a household where the central event, the death around which everything else orbited, could never be named, examined, or mourned. Henry Fonda continued to work. He made films for another 30 years. He received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Kennedy Center. He was treated by the industry and by the culture as a man whose on-screen values were an accurate representation of his character. His 1981 memoir addressed Frances in language that had clearly been considered and calibrated, acknowledging pain without locating responsibility, describing difficulty without specifying cause. It did not mention the lawyer sent to Craighouse. It did not mention the timing of the divorce filing. It did not mention that his daughter had learned the truth about her mother's death from a magazine, because he had chosen to lie to her. In March of 1982, Henry Fonda received the Academy Award for Best Actor for On Golden Pond. He was too ill to attend the ceremony. Jane accepted the award on his behalf. She walked onto that stage, the daughter he had told her mother died of a heart attack, the daughter who had spent 3 decades reconstructing a version of Frances from fragments her father had deliberately withheld. The daughter who had built her public life in part around the very social courage her father made personally unavailable to her. And she accepted the award on his behalf. The image that remained from that night was of a great American actor, a man of serious moral character, a principled figure. Not the man who sent a lawyer. Not the man who filed for divorce while his wife was institutionalized. Not the man who told his 12-year-old daughter that her mother died of a heart attack because the truth did not suit the story he wanted to tell.
Her name.
Frances Ford Seymour is, in most accounts of the Fonda family, a footnote, a difficult first wife, a troubled woman whose instability was unfortunate but ultimately inevitable. A chapter that closed before the more famous chapters began. That framing came from one source. It was constructed by one person, and it served one person's interests. The record, assembled from Frances's own letters, from her psychiatric intake documents, from the accounts of people who knew her, and from the testimony of the children who lived through what happened afterward, tells a different story. It tells the story of a woman who was intelligent, perceptive, and socially capable, who had left one abusive marriage on her own terms, who had managed a complex household and a substantial estate, who fought, through her institutionalizations, not to escape reality but to understand it more clearly. Her letters from those facilities reveal a mind working hard to locate the origins of her own pain. Not a woman surrendering to madness, but a woman trying, with inadequate tools and in an unsupportive environment, to get well. She did not fail to survive because she was weak. She did not fail to survive because her damage was too extensive. She failed to survive because the one person who had the most direct capacity to affect her circumstances made a series of deliberate choices that ensured she would have no way out. Frances Ford Seymour was born April 4, 1908. She died April 14, 1950, at Craig House Psychiatric Hospital in Beacon, New York, on her 42nd birthday. She left 6 letters. Not one of them was addressed to Henry Fonda. That was not an oversight. Frances Ford Seymour was not a woman who forgot things. In the final accounting of her life, in the document she left behind before she left, she named the people who had mattered. She named the people worth addressing. She made a clear and considered decision about who deserved a letter and who did not. After 12 years of managing his image, his household, and his public presentation, after 12 years of performing the version of herself that his life required, her last act was to tell the truth about who she thought he was. She did it without a single word directed at him. Henry Fonda convinced 11 jurors to change their verdict in 107 minutes of screen time. He never convinced the woman he had broken that her life was worth continuing. America remembered him as its conscience. Frances remembered him as the man who made her his instrument and then discarded her when the music stopped. She deserved better than a footnote. She deserved better than a cover story about a heart attack. She deserved better than having her children find out the truth about her death from the pages of a gossip magazine passed under a school desk. Most of all, she deserved to be called by her name, not Henry Fonda's wife, not Jane and Peter's mother. Frances Ford Seymour.